and Quiet Flows the Dawn by Mikhail Sholokhov continued. The meeting began. Stroking his beard, the ataman called out the names of the families and their assignments of wood. "You can't fix the wood-cutting for Thursday," Ivan Tomilin attempted to shout down the ataman. "Why not?" "On Thursday, half the village will be going out to bring in hay. You can leave that till Sunday." "The better the day," a howl of derision arose from the assembly. Old Matvei Kashulin leant across the rickety table and pointed his smooth ash stick at Tomilin. "The hay can wait. You're a fool, brother, and that's that. You've got no brains to boast about anyway." Armless Alexei joined in. For 6 years he had been quarreling with old Kashulin over a piece of land. Every spring Alexei asserted his right to it, but each time Kashulin plowed it up again. "Shut up, St. Vitus." "Pity you're so far away, or I'd give you something to remember me by," Alexei stormed. The ataman banged the table with his fist. "I'll call the militia in a moment if there isn't silence." When order was restored, he added, "Woodcutting will begin on Thursday at dawn." "A fine time. God grant it," arose the jeering remarks. "And one other thing. I've received an instruction from the district ataman." The village ataman raised his voice. "Next Saturday, the youngsters are to go to be sworn in at the district ataman's office. They are to be there by the afternoon." Panteleimon Prokofyevitch was standing by the window nearest the door. At his side, Miran Grigorievitch was sitting on the windowsill, screwing up his eyes and smiling into his beard. Close by them, the younger Cossacks were crowded, winking and smiling at one another. In the middle of this group, the fur cap of the ataman's regiment thrust back on his smooth, bald head, his unaging face everlastingly blushing like a ruddy winter apple, stood Avdyeich Senilin. Avdyeich had served in the ataman's life guards, and had come back with the nickname of Bragger. He had been one of the first in the village to be assigned to the ataman's regiment. Whilst he was on service, a strange thing had happened to him, and from the very first day of his return he had begun to tell astonishing stories of his extraordinary adventures in Petersburg. His astounded listeners at first believed him, drinking it all in with gaping mouths, but then they discovered that Avdyeich was the biggest liar the village had ever produced, and they openly laughed at him. But he was not to be abashed, and did not cease his lying. As he grew old, he began to get annoyed when nailed down to a lie, and would resort to his fists. But if his listeners only laughed and said nothing, he grew more and more fervent in his storytelling. Avdyeich stood in the middle of the room, rocking on his heels. Glancing around the assembled Cossacks, he observed in a ponderous bass voice, "Speaking of service, these days the Cossacks aren't at all what they were. They're small and good for nothing, but," and he smiled contemptuously, "I once saw some dead bones. Ah, they were Cossacks in those days." "Where did you dig the bones up, Avdyeich?" smooth-faced Anikushka asked, nudging his neighbor. "Don't start telling any of your lies, Avdyeich, with the holy day so near." Panteleimon wrinkled up his nose. He did not like Avdyeich's bragging habits. "It isn't my nature to lie, brother," Avdyeich replied truculently, and stared in astonishment at Anikushka, who was shaking as though with fever. "I saw these dead bones when we were building a hut for my brother-in-law. As we were digging the foundations, we came to a grave. The arms were as long as this." He extended both arms wide, "and the head was as big as a copper." "You'd better tell the youngsters how you caught a robber in St. Petersburg," Miran suggested as he rose from the windowsill. "There's nothing really to tell," Avdyeich replied, with a sudden attack of modesty. Tell us, Avdyeich," arose a shout. "Well, it was like this." Avdyeich cleared his throat and drew his tobacco pouch out of his trouser pocket. He poured a pinch of tobacco onto his palm and stared around his audience with eyes beaming. "A thief had escaped from prison. They looked for him everywhere, but do you think they could find him? They just couldn't. All the authorities were beaten. Well, one night the officer of the guard calls me to him. 'Go into that room,' he says. 'His Imperial Majesty is in there. The Sire Emperor himself wants to see you.' Of course I was taken aback a bit, but I went in. I stood to attention, but he claps me on the shoulder and says, 'Listen,' he says, 'Ivan Avdyeich, the biggest thief in our empire has escaped. Look for him and find him, or never let me set eyes on you again.' 'Very good, Your Imperial Majesty,' I said. So I took 3 of the best horses in the Tsar's stables and set out. I rode all day, and I rode all night. until on the third day I came up with the thief near Moscow. I take him into my coach and haul him back to Petersburg. I arrive at midnight, all covered with mud, and go straight to His Imperial Majesty himself. All sorts of counts and princes tried to stop me, but I march on. Yes, I knock at the door. May I come in, Your Imperial Majesty? Who is it? It's me, I said, Ivan Avdyevich Sinilin. I heard a noise in the room and heard His Majesty himself cry out, Maria Fyodorovna, get up quickly and get a samovar going. Ivan Avdyevich has arrived. There was a roar of laughter from the Cossacks at the back of the crowd. The secretary, who was reading a notice concerning a lost animal, stopped in the middle of a sentence, and the ataman stretched out his neck like a goose and stared hard at the crowd, rocking with laughter. Avdyevich's face clouded, and his eyes wandered uncertainly over the faces before him. Wait a bit, he said. Ha ha ha! Oh, he'll be the death of us. Get a samovar going. Avdyevich has arrived. Ha ha ha! The assembly began to break up. On the trampled snow outside the administration hut, Stepan Astachov and a tall, long-shanked Cossack, the owner of the windmill, were stamping about to get themselves warm. When Panteleimon returned from the meeting, he went at once to the room which he and his wife occupied. Ilinichna had been unwell for some days, and her swollen face reflected her weariness and pain. She lay propped up on a plump feather bed. At the sound of Panteleimon's footsteps, she turned her head. Her eyes rested on his beard, damp with his breath, and her nostrils dilated. But the old man smelt only of the frost and the sour sheepskin. Sober today, she thought, and contentedly laid down her knitting needles. Well, what of the woodcutting? She asked. They've decided to begin on Thursday. Panteleimon stroked his beard. Thursday morning, he added, sitting down on a chest at the side of the bed. Well, feeling any better? Just the same, a shooting pain in all my joints. I told you not to go into the water, Panteleimon fumed. There were plenty of other women to steep the hemp. And how's Natalia? He asked suddenly, bending towards the bed. There was a note of anxiety in Ilinichna's voice as she replied, I don't know what to do. She was crying again a day or two ago. I went out into the yard and found someone had left the barn door wide open. I went inside, and she was standing by the millet bin. I asked her what was the matter, but she said she only had a headache. I can't get the truth out of her. Perhaps she's ill. I don't think so. Either someone's given her the evil eye, or else it's Grishka. He hasn't been with that... You haven't heard anything, have you? What are you saying, Father? Ilinichna exclaimed in alarm. And what about Stepan? He's no fool. No, I haven't heard anything. Panteleimon sat with his wife a while longer, then went out. Gregor was in his room, sharpening hooks with a file. Natalia was smearing them with pork grease, and carefully wrapping each in a separate rag. As Panteleimon limped by, he stared inquisitively at her. Her yellow cheeks were flushed like an autumn leaf. She had grown noticeably thinner during the past month, and there was a new, unhappy look in her eyes. The old man halted at the door. He's killing the girl, he thought, as he glanced back at Natalia, bowed over the bench. Drop that, the devil take it, the old man shouted, turning livid with his sudden frenzy. Gregor looked at his father in astonishment. I want to sharpen both ends, Father. Drop it, I tell you. Get ready for the woodcutting. The sledges aren't ready at all, and you sit there sharpening hooks, he added more quietly, and hesitated at the door, evidently wanting to say something else. But he went out. Gregor heard him giving vent to the rest of his anger on Pyotra. A good 2 hours before dawn on the Thursday, Ilinichna got up and called Darya. Get up, time to light the fire. Darya ran in her shift to the stove and struck a light with the flint. Get a move on with it, Pyotr hurried his wife as he lit a cigarette. They don't go and wake that Natashka up. Am I to tear myself in two? Darya fumed. Go and wake her up yourself, Pyotr advised her. But the advice was unnecessary, for Natalia was already up. Flinging on her jacket, she went out to get fuel for the fire. The kitchen smelt of fresh kvass, harness, and the warmth of human bodies. Darya bustled about, shuffling in her felt boots. Under her rose-colored shift, her little breasts quivered. Her married life had not soured or withered her. Tall and slender, supple as a willow switch, she was as fresh as a young girl. Dawn broke before the meal was ready. Panteleimon hurried over his breakfast, blowing on the thick porridge. Gregor ate slowly, his face clouded. and Pyotr amused himself with teasing Dunya, who was suffering with toothache and had her face bound up. There was the sound of sledge runners in the street. Bullock sledges were moving down to the Don in the gray dawn. Griegor and Pyotr went out to harness their sledges. As he went, Griegor wound a soft scarf, his wife's gift, around his neck. A crow flew overhead with a full, throaty cry. Pyotr watched its flight and remarked, "Flying to the south, to the warmth." Behind a rosy little cloud, as gay as a maiden smile, a tiny slip of moon gleamed dimly. The smoke from the chimneys rose in columns, reaching toward the inaccessibly distant golden slip of the young moon. The river was not completely frozen over opposite the Melyukovs' hut. Along the edges of the stream, the ice was firm and green with accumulated drift snow. But beyond the middle, towards the black cliff, the ice holes yawned somber and menacing out of the white snow. Panteleimon drove off first with the old bullocks, leaving his sons to follow later. At the slope down to the river crossing, Pyotr and Griegor caught up with Anikushka. He was walking at the side of his bullocks, and his wife, a stocky, sickly woman, held the reins. Pyotr called out to him, "Hello, neighbor. Surely you're not taking your woman with you?" Anikushka smiled and turned to talk to the brothers. "Yes, I am, to keep me warm," he replied. "You'll get no warmth from her. She's too lean." "That's true, and I feed her with oats, but still she doesn't fatten." The three drove on together. The forest was laced with rime and of a virgin whiteness. Anikushka went in front, lashing his whip against the branches overhead. The needly and crumbling snow fell in showers, sprinkling over his wife. "Don't play about, you devil," she shouted at him as she shook the snow off. "Drop her into the snow," Pyotr advised. At a turn of the road, they met Stepan Astachov driving 2 yoked bullocks back towards the village. His curly hair hung below his fur cap like a bunch of white grapes. "Hey, Stepan, lost your road?" Anikushka exclaimed as he passed. "Lost my way be damned. We swung over, and the sledge struck a stump and snapped a runner in two, so I've got to go back." Stepan cursed, and his eyes suddenly darkened as he passed Pyotr. "Left your sledge behind?" Anikushka asked, turning round. Stepan waved his hand, cracked his whip, and gave Griegor a hard stare. A little farther on, the group came to a sledge abandoned in the middle of the road. Aksenia was standing by it, holding the edge of her sheepskin with her hand. She was gazing along the road in their direction. "Out of the way, or I'll drive over you. You're not my wife," Anikushka snorted. Aksenia stepped aside with a smile and sat down on the overturned sledge. "I'd take you along, but I've got my own wife with me," Anikushka explained as he drove by. As Pyotr came up to her, he gave a quick glance back at Griegor, who was some distance behind. Griegor was smiling uncertainly, anxiety and expectation expressed in all his movements. "What? Sledge broken?" Pyotr asked. "Yes," she replied, and rising to her feet, turned away from Pyotr towards Griegor. "Griegor Pantelyevich, I'd like a word with you," she said, as he came up to her. Asking Pyotr to look after his bullocks for a moment, Griegor turned to her. Pyotr laughed suggestively and drove on. The two stood silently regarding each other. Aksenia glanced cautiously around, then turned her humid black eyes again to Griegor's face. Shame and joy flamed in her cheeks and dried her lips. Her breath came in sharp gasps. At a turn in the road, Anikushka and Pyotr disappeared behind the brown oak trunks. "Well, Grishka, it's as you wish. But I've no strength left to live without you," she said firmly, and pressed her lips together in expectation of his answer. Griegor made no reply. The silence fettered the forest in its grip. The glassy emptiness rang in his ears. The smooth surface of the road, polished with sledge runners, the gray rag of sky, the dumb, mortally drowsy forest. A sudden cry of a raven nearby seemed to arouse Griegor from his momentary lethargy. He raised his head and watched the bird winging its silent flight. Unexpectedly to himself he said, "It's going to be warm. He's flying towards the warmth." Starting, he laughed hoarsely. "Well?" He turned his intoxicated eyes to Aksenia and suddenly snatched her towards himself. During the winter evenings, a little group of villagers gathered in Stockman's room at Lukashka's hut. There were Kristonia and Valyat from the mill, ever-smiling David, now 3 months a loafer, the engine-man, Ivan Alexeyevich Kotlyarov, occasionally Filka, the cobbler, and always Misha Koshevoy, a young Cossack who had not yet done his regular army service. At first, the group played cards. Then Stockman casually brought out a book of Nekrasov's poetry. They began to read the volume aloud and liked it. Then they went on to Nikitin, and about Christmas time, Stockman suggested the reading of a dog-eared, unbound, and well-bethumbed brochure. Koshevoy, who had been to the church school, read aloud from it as he contemptuously glanced through the greasy pages. "You could make vermicelli of it, it's so greasy," he said in disgust. Kristonia roared with laughter. David smiled dazzlingly, but Stockman waited for the merriment to die away and then said, "Read it, Misha. It's interesting. It's all about the Cossacks." Bending his head over the table, Koshevoy spelt out laboriously, "Short History of the Don Cossacks," and then glanced around expectantly. "Read it," Kotlyarov, the engine-man, ordered. They labored through the book for 3 evenings, reading about the free life of the past, about Pugachev, Stenka Razin, and Vasily Bulovin. Finally, they came down to recent times. The unknown author poured scorn on the Cossacks' miserable existence. He jeered intelligently and powerfully at the authorities in the system, the Tsar's government, and the Cossackry itself, which had hired itself out to the monarchs as their bodyguard. The listeners grew excited and began to quarrel among themselves. Stockman sat at the door, smoking a pipe and smiling. "He's right, it's all true," Kristonia would burst out. The engineer Kotlyarov was steeped to the backbone in Cossack traditions, and he defended the Cossacks vigorously, his bulging round eyes glittering. "You're a peasant, Christian. Your Cossack blood's a drop in the bucket. Your mother was mated with a peasant from Voronezh." You're a fool, brother," Kristonia replied vigorously. "Shut up, peasant." "And aren't the peasants just as much men as you?" "They're peasants, made of bast and stuffed with brushwood." "When I was serving in Petersburg, brother, I saw many things," Kristonia said. "Once it happened that we were on guard at the Tsar's palace, inside the rooms and around the walls outside. We rode around, 2 this way and 2 that. When we met, we used to ask, 'All quiet? No risings anywhere?' And then we'd ride on. We weren't allowed to stop and talk. And they chose us for our looks. When we had to take our turn on guard at the doors, they chose each pair so that they should be alike in their faces and their figures. The barber once had to dye my beard because of it. I had to take a turn at guard with some Cossack whose beard was a bay color. They searched all through the regiment, and there wasn't another like him. So the troop commander sent me to the barber to have my beard dyed. When I looked in the glass afterwards, my heart almost broke. I burned, absolutely burned." "Yes, Kristonia, but what's all this to do with the question? What were you going to tell us?" Kotlyarov interrupted him. "About the people. I was just telling you I once had to take a turn on guard outside. We were riding along, me and my comrade, when some students came running round the corner. As soon as they saw us, they roared, 'Ha!' and then again, 'Ha!' We hadn't time to call out before they had surrounded us. 'What are you riding about for, Cossacks?' they asked, and I said, 'We're keeping guard. You let go of the reins,' and clapped my hands on my sword. 'Don't distrust me, Cossack. I'm from Kamyanska district myself, and I'm studying in the university,' one said. We make to ride on, and he pulls out a 10-ruble piece and says, 'Drink to the health of my dead father.' And he draws a picture out of his pocket. 'Look, that's my father,' he says. 'Take it as a keepsake.' Well, we took it. We couldn't refuse. And they went off again. Just then an officer comes running out of the back door of the palace with a troop of men. 'Who was that?' he shouts. And I tell him students had come and begun talking to us. And we had wanted to saber them according to instructions, but as they had set us free, we had ridden off. When we went off duty later, we told the corporal we'd earned 10 rubles and wanted to drink them to the health of the old man, showing him the portrait. In the evening, the corporal brought some vodka, and we had a good time for a couple of days. Then it turned out that this student had given us the portrait of the chief rebel of Germany. I had hung it above my bed. He had a gray beard and was a decent sort of man, looked like a merchant. The troop commander saw it and asked, 'Where did you get that picture from?' So I told him, and he began to roar. 'Do you know who that is? He's their ataman, Karl. Drat it, I've forgotten his name. What was it?' Karl Marx? Stockmann suggested with a smile. That's it, Karl Marx, Kristonia exclaimed joyfully. But we drank the 10 rubles. It was the bearded Karl we drank to, but we drank them. He deserves to be drunk to, Stockmann smiled, playing with his cigarette holder. Why, what good did he do? Kolyarov queried. I'll tell you another time. It's getting late now. Stockmann held the holder between his fingers and ejected the dead cigarette end with a slap from the other hand. After long selection and testing, a little group of 10 Cossacks began to meet regularly in Stockmann's workshop. Stockmann was the heart and soul of the group, and went straight towards the end he had in mind. He ate into the simple understandings and conceptions like a worm into wood, instilling repugnance and hatred towards the existing system. At first he found himself confronted with the cold steel of distrust, but he was not to be repulsed. On the sandy slope of the left bank of the Don lies the center of Vishenska, the most ancient of the district centers of the Upper Don, transferred from the town of Chigonak, which was destroyed during the reign of Peter I and renamed Vishenska. It was formerly an important link along the great waterway from Voronezh to Azov. Opposite Vishenska, the Don bends like a Tartar bow, turns sharply to the right, and by the little village of Bazka majestically straightens again, carries its greenish-blue waters over the chalky feet of the hills on the west bank, past the thickly clustered villages on the right, and the rare hamlets on the left, down to the sea, to the blue sea of Azov. Vishenska stands among dunes of yellow sands. It is a bare, unhappy village, without gardens or orchards. On the square stands an old church, gray with age, and 6 streets run out of the square in lines parallel with the river. Where the Don bends toward Baska, a lake, as broad as the Don at low tide, runs like a sleeve into willows. The far end of Vishenska runs down to this lake, and on a smaller square, overgrown with golden prickly thorn, is a second church, with a green cupola and green roof, standing under the green of the willows. Beyond the village to the north stretches a saffron waste of sands, a miserable pine plantation, and groves flooded with rust-colored water. Here and there, in the sandy wilderness, are rare oases of villages, meadowland, and a gray scrub of willows. One Sunday in December, a dense crowd of 1,500 young Cossacks from all the villages in the district was assembled on the square outside the old church. Mass ended. The senior sergeant, a brave-looking, elderly Cossack with long service decorations, gave an order, and the youngsters drew up in 2 long, unequal ranks. Followed by his staff, the ataman entered the church enclosure, dressed according to form, and wearing a new officer's cloak, his spurs jingling. Falling back a pace or 2, the senior sergeant swung on his heels and shouted, "By the right, quick, march!" The 2 lines filed through the wide-open gate, and the church rang to the cupola with the sound of tramping feet. Gregor paid no attention to the words of the oath of allegiance being read by the priest. By his side stood Mitka Korshunov, his face contorted with the pain of his tight new boots. Gregor's upraised arm grew numb. A jumbled train of thought slipped through his mind. As he passed under the crucifix and kissed the silver, damp with the moisture of many lips, he thought of Aksenia, of his wife. He had a fleeting vision of the forest, its brown trunks and branches lined with white down, and the humid gleam of Aksenia's black eyes beneath her kerchief. When the ceremony was ended, they were marched out into the square and again drawn up in ranks. Blowing his nose and stealthily wiping his fingers on the lining of his coat, the sergeant addressed them. "You're not boys any longer now. You're Cossacks. You've taken the oath, and you ought to understand what it means and what you've sworn to do. You're grown up into Cossacks now, and you must watch over your honor, obey your fathers and mothers, and so on. You were boys, you played about, you may even have played tip-cat in the road, but now you must think about your future service. In a year's time, you will be called up into the army." Here the sergeant blew his nose again, brushed his hands, and ended, as he drew on his fur gloves, "And your father or mother must think about getting you your equipment. They must provide you with an army horse, and, in general, and now, home you go, and God be with you, boys." Gregor and Mitka picked up the rest of the lads from their village, and they set off together for Tatarsk. It was dusk when they reached the village. Gregor went up the steps of the hut and glanced in at the window. The hanging lamp shed a dim yellow light through the room. Pyotr was standing in its light with his back to the window. Gregor brushed the snow off his boots with the besom at the door and entered the kitchen amid a cloud of steam. "Well, I'm back," he announced. "You've been quick. You must be frozen," Pyotr replied, in an anxious and hurried tone. Panteleimon was sitting with his head bowed in his hands, his elbows on his knees. Darya was spinning at the droning spinning wheel. Natalia was standing at the table with her back to Gregor and did not turn round on his entry. Glancing hastily around the kitchen, Gregor rested his eyes on Pyotr. By his brother's agitatedly expectant face, he guessed that something had happened. "Taken the oath?" Pyotr asked. "Aha!" Gregor took off his outdoor clothes slowly, playing for time and turning over in his mind all the possibilities which might have led to this chilly and silent welcome. Ilinichna came out of the best room, her face expressing her agitation. "It's Natalia," Gregor thought, as he sat down on the bench beside his father. "Get him some supper," his mother said to Darya, indicating Gregor with her eyes. Darya stopped in the middle of her spinning song and went to the stove. The kitchen was engulfed in a silence broken only by the heavy breathing of a goat and her newly born kid. As Gregor sipped his soup, he glanced at Natalia, but he could not see her face. She was sitting sideways to him, her head bent over her knitting needles. Panteleimon was the first to be provoked into speech by the general silence. Coughing artificially, he said, "Natalia is talking about going back to her parents." Gregor wiped his plate clean with his bread and said nothing. "What's the reason?" his father asked, his lower lip quivering, the first sign of a coming outburst of frenzy. "I don't know," Gregor replied as he rose and crossed himself. "But I know," his father raised his voice. Don't shout, Ilinichna interposed. "Yes, there's no cause for shouting." Pyotr moved from the window to the middle of the room. "It all depends on love. If you want to, you live together. If you don't, well, God be with you. I'm not judging her. Even if she was a wanton hussy and sinful in the sight of God, still I'd not judge her, but that swine there." Panteleimon pointed to Gregor, who was warming himself at the stove. "Who have I done wrong to?" Gregor asked. "You don't know? You don't know, you devil?" "No, I don't." Panteleimon jumped from his seat, overturning the bench, and went right up to Gregor. Natalia threw down her stocking. The needles clattered to the floor. At the sound, a kitten jumped down from the stove and began to play with the ball of wool. "What I say to you is this," the old man began slowly and deliberately. "If you won't live with Natalia, you can clear out of this house and go wherever your feet will carry you. That's what I say to you. Go where your feet will carry you," he repeated in a calm voice, and turned and picked up the bench. "What I say to you, Father, I don't say in anger." Gregor's voice was jarringly hollow. "I didn't marry of my own choice. It was you who married me off. And I have no feeling for Natalia. Let her go back to her father if she wants to. You clear out yourself. And I will go, and go to the devil. I'm going. Don't be in a hurry." Gregor stretched out his hand for his short fur coat, lying on the bed, distending his nostrils and trembling with the same boiling anger as his father. The same mingled Turkish and Cossack blood flowed in their veins, and at that moment their resemblance to each other was extraordinary. "Where are you going?" Ilinichna groaned, seizing Gregor's arm, but he forcibly threw her off and snatched up his fur cap. "Let him go, the sinful swine! Let him go, curse him! Go on, go, clear out!" the old man thundered, throwing the door wide open. Gregor ran out onto the steps, and the last sound he heard was Natalia's weeping. The frosty night held the village in its grip. A needly powder was falling from the inky sky. The ice on the dawn was cracking like pistol shots. Gregor ran panting out of the gate. At the far end of the village, dogs were barking in chorus. Yellow points of light shone through the frosty haze. He walked aimlessly down the street. Astachov's windows sparkled like diamonds through the darkness. "Grishka!" he heard Natalia's yearning cry from the gate. "Go to hell, you fickle bitch!" Gregor grated his teeth and hastened his steps. "Grishka, come back!" He turned into the first cross lane, and for the last time heard her distant, bitter cry, "Grishenka, dearest!" He swiftly crossed the square and stopped at a fork in the road, wondering with whom he could spend the night. He decided on Misha Koshevoy. Misha lived with his mother and sister in a lonely straw-thatched hut right by the hill. Gregor entered their yard and knocked at the tiny window. "Who's there? Is Misha in?" "Yes. Who is it wants him?" "It's me, Gregor Melyukov." After a moment, Misha, awakened from his first sleep, opened the door. "You, Grishka?" "Me. What do you want at this time of night? Let me in and I'll tell you inside." In the porch, Gregor seized Misha by the elbow and whispered, "I want to spend the night with you. I've fallen out with my people. Have you got room for me? Anything will do." "We'll fix you up somewhere. What's the row all about? I'll tell you later." They made Gregor a bed on the bench. He lay thinking, his head wrapped in his sheepskin to muffle the snores of Misha's mother. What was happening at home now, he wondered. Would Natalia go back to her father or not? Well, life had taken a new turn. Where should he go? And the answer came swiftly. He would send for Aksenia tomorrow and go with her to the Kuban, far away from the village. Far away. Away. His sleep was troubled by the approaching unknown. Before he finally dropped off, he tried hard to recall what it was that oppressed him. In his drowsy state, his thoughts would flow easily and smoothly like a boat downstream. Then suddenly they would come up against something, as though the boat had struck a sandbank. He wrestled with the baffling obstacle. What was it that lay across the road? In the morning he awoke and at once remembered his army service. That was it. How could he go away with Aksenia? In the spring there was the training camp, and in the autumn the army draft. He had some breakfast and called Misha into the porch. "Misha, go to the Astachovs for me, will you?" he asked. "Tell Aksenia to go to the windmill this evening after dark." "But what about Stepan?" Misha stammered. "Say you've come on some business or other." "All right, I'll go. Tell her to be sure to go along." In the evening, Gregor went and sat down by the windmill. He lit a cigarette. Beyond the windmill, the wind was stumbling over withered maize stalks. The torn linen flapped on the motionless sails. He thought it sounded like a great bird winging around the mill and unable to fly away, and it was unpleasant and disturbing. Aksenia did not come. The sun had set in the west in a fading, gilded lilac. The wind began to flow freshly from the east. The darkness overtook the moon, stranded among the willows. Above the windmill, the sky was deathly dark, with blue streaks. From the village came the last sounds of the day's activities. He smoked 3 cigarettes in succession, thrust the last end into the trodden snow, and gazed around in anxious irritation. There was no one in sight. He rose, stretched himself, and moved towards the light, twinkling invitingly in Misha's window. He was approaching the yard when he stumbled into Aksenia. She had evidently been running. She was out of breath, and the scent of the winter wind, or perhaps of fresh steppe hay, came from her cold mouth. "I waited and thought you weren't coming," he said. "I had to get rid of Stepan. I'm frozen through you, you accursed woman. I'm hot. I'll warm you." She flung open her wool-lined coat and wrapped herself around Gregor like hops around an oak. "Why did you send for me?" she asked. "Wait. Take my arm. There are people likely to be around here. You haven't quarreled with your people?" "I've left them. I spent the night with Misha. I'm a homeless dog now." They turned off the road, and Gregor, sweeping away the drift snow, leant against a wattle fence. "You don't know whether Natalia has gone home, do you?" he asked. "I don't. She'll go, I expect." Gregor slipped Aksenia's frozen hand up the sleeve of his coat, and squeezing her slender fingers, he asked, "And what about us?" "I don't know, dear. Whatever you think best." "Will you leave Stepan?" "Without a sigh. This evening, if you like." "And we'll find work somewhere and live somehow. I'll sleep with the cattle to be with you, Grishka. Anything to be with you." They stood close together, each warming the other. Gregor did not want to stir. He stood with his head towards the wind, his nostrils quivering, his eyelids closed. Her face pressed into his armpit, Aksenia breathed in the familiar, intoxicating scent of his sweat, and on her shamelessly avid lips, hidden from Gregor's eyes, trembled a joyous smile. "Tomorrow I'll go and see Mokhov. He may be able to give me work," Gregor said, gripping Aksenia's moist arm above the hand. Aksenia did not speak, nor did she raise her head. The smile slipped from her face like a dying wind. Anxiety and fear started to her dilated eyes like a frightened animal. "Shall I tell him or not?" she thought, as she remembered that she was pregnant. I must tell him, she decided, but immediately, trembling with fear, she drove away the terrible thought. Her woman's instinct divined that this was not the moment to tell him. She realized that she might lose Gregor forever, and uncertain whether the child leaping beneath her heart was Gregor's or Stepan's, she temporized and did not tell him. "What did you tremble for? Are you cold?" Gregor asked, wrapping her in his coat. "I am a little. I must go, Grishka. Stepan will come back and find me not there. Where's he gone? I took him along to Anike to play cards." They parted. The agitating scent of her lips remained on Gregor's lips. The scent of the winter wind, or perhaps the intangible scent of rain-sprinkled steppe hay. Aksenia turned into a byway, bowed and almost running. By a well where the cattle had churned up the autumn mud, she stumbled awkwardly, her foot slipping on a frozen clod, and feeling a lacerating pain in her bowels, she caught at the fence. The pain died away, but in her side something living, turning, knocked angrily and strongly, time and again. Next morning, Gregor went to see Mokhov. Sergei Platonovich had just returned from the shop and was sitting in the dining room, sipping strong, claret-colored tea. Gregor left his cap in the anteroom and went in. "I'd like to have a word with you, Sergei Platonovich," he said. "Ah, Panteleimon Melyakov's son, isn't it? What do you want?" "I've come to ask whether you could take me on as a workman." As Gregor spoke, the door creaked, and a young officer in a green tunic with a troop commander's epaulets entered. Gregor recognized him as the young Listnitsky, whom Mitka Korshinov had outraced the previous summer. Sergei Platonovich gave the officer a chair and turned back to Gregor. "Has your father come down in the world, that he is putting his son out to work?" he inquired. "I'm no longer living with him." "Left him?" "Yes." "Well, I'd gladly take you on. I know your family to be a hard-working lot. But I'm afraid I haven't any work for you to do." "What's the matter?" Listnitsky inquired, pulling his chair up to the table. "This lad is looking for work." "Can you look after horses? Can you drive a pair?" the officer asked as he stirred his tea. "I can. I've had the care of our own 6 horses." "I want a coachman. What wage do you require?" "I'm not asking for much." "In that case, come to my father at our estate tomorrow. You know the house? At Yagodnoye? Some 8 miles from here?" "Yes, I know it." Gregor went to the door. As he turned the handle, he hesitated and said, "I'd like to have a word with you in private, sir." Listnitsky followed Gregor out into the twilit passage. A rosy light filtered dimly through the Venetian glass of the door leading to the balcony. "Well, what is it?" the officer asked. "I'm not alone." Gregor flushed darkly. "I've a woman with me. Perhaps you can find something for her to do?" "Your wife?" Listnitsky inquired, smiling and raising his eyebrows. "Someone else's wife." "Ah, so that's it, is it? All right. We'll fix her up as cook for the servants. But where is her husband?" "Here, in the village." "So, you've stolen another man's wife." "She came of her own accord." "A romantic story. Well, don't fail to come tomorrow. You can go now." Gregor arrived at Yagodnoye at about 8 the next morning. The great house stood in a broad valley and was surrounded by a brick wall. Outbuildings straggled over the yard. A wing with a tiled roof, the date 1910 picked out with tiles of a different color. The servants' quarters, a bathhouse, stables, poultry house, and cattle shed. A long barn and a coach house. The main building was old and nestled in an orchard. Beyond the house rose bare poplars and the willows of the meadows, empty crow's nests swinging in their brown tops. As he entered the yard, Gregor was welcomed by a pack of Crimean borzois. An old lame bitch was the first to snuff at him and follow him with drooping head. In the servants' quarters, a cook was quarreling with a young freckled maid. Sitting in a cloud of tobacco smoke at the threshold was an old, bowed man. The maid conducted Gregor to the house. The anteroom smelt of dogs and uncured pelts. On a table lay the case of a double-barreled gun and a fringed game bag. and Quiet Flows the Dawn by Mikhail Sholokhov continued. On a table lay the case of a double-barreled gun and a fringed game bag. "The young master will see you," the maid called to Gregor through a side door. Gregor looked anxiously at his muddy boots and entered. Listnitsky was lying on a bed under the window. The officer rolled a cigarette, buttoned up the collar of his white shirt, and remarked, "You're in good time. Wait, my father will be here in a minute." Gregor stood by the door. After a moment or two, there was the sound of footsteps in the anteroom, and a deep bass voice asked through the door, "Are you asleep, Eugene?" "Come in," Listnitsky replied. An old man wearing a black Caucasian cloak entered. Gregor gave him a stealthy glance. He was immediately struck by the fine, hooked nose and the white, tobacco-stained arch of whiskers. Old Listnitsky was tall and broad-shouldered, but gaunt. Beneath the cloak, a long coat of camel hair hung on him. His eyes were set close to his nose. "Papa, here is the coachman I spoke to you about," Eugene remarked. "Whose son is he?" "Panteleimon Melyakov's." "I knew Prokofy. He was in the army with me. I remember Panteleimon, too. Lame, isn't he?" "Yes, Your Excellency," Gregor replied, mentally recalling his father's stories of the retired General Listnitsky, a hero of the Russo-Turkish War. "Why are you seeking work?" the old man inquired. "I'm not living with my father, Your Excellency." "What sort of Cossack will you make if you hire yourself out? Didn't your father provide for you when you left him?" "No, Your Excellency." That's another matter. You want work for your wife as well?" The younger Listnitsky's bed creaked heavily. Gregor turned his eyes in that direction and saw the officer winking. "That's right, Your Excellency," he answered. "Without any excellencies, I don't like them. Your wage will be 8 rubles a month, for both of you. Your wife will cook for the yard and seasonal workers. Is that satisfactory?" "Yes." "Come along tomorrow morning. You will occupy the room the previous coachman had. And now, quick march. Be here at 8. Gregor went out. On the far side of the barn, the barzois were sunning themselves on a patch of ground bare of snow. The old bitch followed Gregor a little way, with head still drooping mournfully, then turned back. That same morning, Aksenia finished cooking early. She raked out the fire, washed the dishes, and glanced out of the window, looking onto the yard. Stepan was standing by the woodpile close to the fence bordering on the Melyakovs' yard. The left-hand corner of the shed was tumbling down, and he was selecting posts suitable for its repair. Aksenia had arisen with 2 rosy blushes in her cheeks and a youthful glitter in her eyes. Stepan noticed the change, and as he was having breakfast he could not forbear to ask, "What's happened to you?" "What's happened?" Aksenia echoed him. "Your face is shining as though you had smeared yourself with butter." "It's the heat of the fire." And turning round, she glanced stealthily out of the window to see whether Misha Koshevoy's sister was coming. But the girl did not arrive until late in the afternoon. Tormented with waiting, Aksenia started up, asking, "Do you want me, Marshutka?" "Come out for a moment," the girl replied. Stepan was combing his hair before a scrap of mirror fixed above the stove. Aksenia looked at him nervously. "You aren't going out, are you?" she asked. He did not answer immediately, but put the comb into his trouser pocket and picked up a pack of cards and his tobacco pipe lying on the stove ledge. Then he said, "I'm going along to Anikushka's for a while." "And when are you ever at home? You spend every night at cards. You're not going to play for points." "Enough of that, Aksenia. There's someone waiting for you." Aksenia went out. Marshutka welcomed her with a smile and a droop of her eyelashes. "Grishka's come back," she said. "Well?" "He told me to tell you to come along to our hut as soon as it's dark." Seizing the girl's hand, Aksenia drew her towards the outer door. "Softer, softer, dear. Did he tell you to say anything else?" "He said you were to get your things together and take them along." Burning and trembling, stepping from foot to foot like a mettlesome horse, Aksenia turned and glanced at the kitchen door. "Lord, how am I to... so quickly? Well, wait. Tell him I'll be along as soon as I can. But where will he meet me?" "You're to come to our hut." "Oh, no." "All right, I'll tell him to come out and wait for you." Stepan was drawing on his coat as Aksenia went in. "What did she want?" he asked, between 2 puffs at a cigarette. "Oh, she came to ask me to cut out a skirt for her." Blowing the ash off his cigarette, Stepan went to the door. "Don't wait up for me," he said as he went out. Aksenia ran to the frosted window and dropped to her knees before the bench. Stepan's footsteps sounded along the path trodden out in the snow to the gate. The wind caught a spark from his cigarette and carried it back to the window. Through the melted circle of glass, Aksenia caught a glimpse of his fur cap and the profile of his face. She feverishly turned jackets, skirts, and kerchiefs, her dowry, out of the great chest and threw them into a large shawl. Panting, her eyes wandering, she passed through the kitchen for the last time, and putting out the light, ran onto the steps. She fastened the kitchen door by the chain. Someone emerged from the Melyakovs' hut to see to the cattle. She waited until the footsteps had died away, then ran down to the dawn. Strands of hair escaped from her kerchief and tickled her cheeks. Clutching her bundle, she made her way by side lanes to the Koshevoy's hut, her strength ebbing, her feet feeling like cast iron. Gregor was waiting for her at the gate. He took the bundle and silently led the way into the steppe. Beyond the hut, Aksenia slowed her pace and caught at Gregor's sleeve. "Wait a moment," she asked him. "What is there to wait for? The moon will be late tonight, so we must hurry." "Wait, Grishka." She halted, doubled up with pain. "What's the matter?" Gregor turned back to her. "Something in my belly. I carried too much away with me." She licked her dry lips and clutched at her bowels. She stood a moment, bowed and miserable, and then, poking her hair under her kerchief, set off again. "You haven't asked where I'm taking you to. I might be leading you to the nearest cliff to push you over," Gregor smiled in the darkness. "It's all the same to me now. I can't go back." Her voice trembled with an unhappy smile. That night, Stepan returned at midnight as usual. He went first to the stable, threw the scattered hay back into the manger, removed the horse's halter, then went to the hut. She must have gone out for the evening, he thought, as he unfastened the chain. He entered the kitchen, closed the door fast, and struck a match. He had been in a winning vein that evening, and so was quiet and drowsy. He lit the lamp and gaped at the disorder of the kitchen, not divining the reason. A little astonished, he went into the best room. The open chest yawned blackly. On the floor lay an old jacket, which Aksenia had forgotten in her hurry. Stepan tore off his sheepskin and ran back to the kitchen for the light. He stared around the best room, and at last he understood. He dropped the lamp, tore his saber down from the wall, gripped the hilt until the veins swelled in his fingers, raised Aksenia's blue and yellow jacket on its point, threw the jacket up in the air, and with a short swing of the saber cut it in two as it fell. Gray, savage in his wolfish yearning, he threw the pieces of old jacket up to the ceiling again and again. The sharp steel whistled as it cut them in their flight. Then, tearing off the sword knot, he threw the saber into a corner, went into the kitchen, and sat down at the table. His head bowed, with trembling fingers, he stroked the unwashed tabletop time after time. Troubles never come singly. The morning after Gregor had left home, through Getka's carelessness, Miran Korshunov's pedigree bull gored the throat of his finest mare. Getka came running into the kitchen, white, distracted, and trembling. "Trouble, master! The bull, curse him! The damned bull!" "Well, what about the bull?" Miran asked in alarm. "He's done the mare in, gored her." Miran ran, half undressed, into the yard. By the well, Mitka was beating the red 5-year-old bull with a stick. The bull, his head down and dewlap dragging over the snow, was churning up the snow with his hoofs and scattering a silvery powder around his tail. He would not yield before the drubbing, but danced about on his hind legs as though intending to charge. Mitka beat him on the nose and sides, cursing the while, and paying no heed to the laborer who was trying to drag him back by his belt. Miran Grigorievich ran to the well. The mare was standing by the fence, her head drooping and a fine shiver running over her body. Her heaving flanks were wet with sweat, and blood was running down her chest. A rose-colored wound, a handbreadth deep, and revealing the windpipe, gaped on her neck. Miran seized her by the forelock and raised her head. The mare fixed her glazing eyes on her master as though mutely asking, "What next?" As if in answer to the question, Miran shouted, "Run and tell someone to scald some oak bark. Hurry!" Getka ran to strip some bark from a tree, and Mitka came across to his father, one eye fixed on the bull, circling and bellowing about the yard. "Hold the mare by her forelock," his father ordered. "Someone run for some twine, quickly." They tied string round the mare's upper lip so that she should not feel pain, and then washed the wound. With freezing fingers, Miran threaded raw thread through a darning needle and sewed up the edges, making a neat seam. He had hardly turned away to go back to the house when his wife came running from the kitchen, alarm written large on her face. She called her husband aside. "Natalia's here, Grigorich. Ah, my God!" "Now what's the matter?" Miran demanded, his face paling. "It's Gregor. He's left home." Lukinichna flung out her arms like a rook preparing for flight, clapped her hands against her skirt, and broke into a whine. "Disgraced before all the village. Lord, what a blow! Oh!" Miran found Natalia standing in the middle of the kitchen. 2 tears welled in her eyes. Her cheeks were deeply flushed. "What are you doing here?" her father blustered as he ran into the room. "Has your husband beaten you? Can't you get on together?" "He's gone away," Natalia groaned, and she swayed and fell on her knees before her father. "Father, my life is blighted. Take me back. Gregor's gone away with that woman. He's left me. Father, I've been crushed into the dust," she sobbed, gazing imploringly up at her father's gray beard. Wait now. I can't go on living there. Take me back." She crawled on her knees to the chest and dropped her head onto her arms. Tears at such a time are like rain in a May drought. Her mother pressed Natalia's head against her skirt, whispering soothing, motherly words, but Miran, infuriated, ran out to the steps. "Harness 2 horses into the sleigh," he shouted. A cock, pattering importantly around behind its hen on the steps, took alarm at the shout, jumped away, and fluttered agitatedly off towards the barn, squawking indignantly. "Harness the horses!" Miran kicked again and again at the fretted balustrade of the steps until it was hopelessly ruined. He returned to the kitchen only when Getka hurried out from the stables with the pair of horses, harnessing them as he went. Mitka drove with Getka to the Melyukovs for Natalia's possessions. In his abstraction, Getka sent a young pig in the road flying. Maybe the master will forget all about the mare now, he was thinking, and rejoiced, letting the reins hang loose. But he's such an old devil he'll never forget. And Getka brought the whiplash hard down across the horse's back. Chapter 10. Eugene Listnitsky held a commission as troop commander in the Ataman's Life Guard regiment. Having had a tumble during the officers' hurdle races and broken his left arm, when he came out of hospital, he took furlough and went to stay with his father for 6 weeks. The old general lived alone in Yagodnaya. He had lost his wife while driving in the suburbs of Warsaw in the 80s of the 19th century. Revolutionaries had attempted to shoot the Cossack general, had missed him, but had killed his wife and coachman. Listnitsky was left with his 2-year-old son Eugene. Soon after this event, the general retired, went to live at Yagodnaya, and lived a lonely, harsh life. He sent his son Eugene to the Cadets Corps as soon as the lad was old enough, and occupied himself with farming. He purchased bloodstock from the imperial stables, crossed them with the finest mares from England, and from the famous Provalsky stables, and reared a new stock. He raised cattle and livestock on his own and rented land, sowed grain with hired labor, hunted with his barzois in the autumn and winter, and occasionally locked himself into the hall and drank for a week on end. He was troubled with a stomach complaint, and his doctor had strictly forbidden him to swallow anything. He had to extract the goodness from all his food by mastication, spitting out the residue onto a silver tray held by his personal servant, Benjamin. Benjamin was a half-witted, swarthy young peasant with a shock of thick black hair. He had been in Listnitsky's service for 6 years. When he first had to wait on the general, he could not bear to watch the old man spitting out the chewed food. But after a time he grew accustomed to it. After some months, he thought as he watched his master chewing the white meat of a turkey, "What a waste of good food. He doesn't eat it himself, and my belly is turning over with hunger. I'll try it after he's finished with it." After that, he made a practice of carrying the silver tray into the anteroom when his master had dined, and there hurriedly gulping down all that was left. Perhaps it was for this reason that he began to grow fat and double-chinned. The other inhabitants of the farm were the maid, the pockmarked cook Lukeria, the ancient stableman Sashka, and the shepherd Tikhon. From the very first, Lukeria would not allow Aksenia to help in the cooking for the master, and Aksenia was set to work washing the floors of the house 3 times a week, feeding the innumerable fowls, and keeping the fowl-house clean. Gregor spent much of his time in the spacious stables with Sashka, the stableman. The old man was one mass of gray hair, but everybody still familiarly called him Sashka. Probably even old Listnitsky, for whom he had worked more than 20 years, had forgotten his surname. In his youth, Sashka had been the coachman, but as he grew old and feeble and his sight began to fail, he was made stableman. Stocky, covered with greenish-gray hair, with a nose that had been flattened by a stick in his youth, he wore an everlasting, childish smile, and gazed out on the world with twinkling, artless eyes. The reverend, apostolic expression of his face was marred by his broken nose and his hanging, scarred underlip. Sashka was fond of vodka, and when he was in his cups he would wander about the yard as though he were master. Stamping his feet, he would stand beneath old Listnitsky's bedroom and call, loudly and sternly, "Mikolai Alexievich! Mikolai Alexievich!" If old Listnitsky happened to be in his bedroom, he would come to the window. "You're drunk, you scoundrel," he would thunder. Sashka would hitch up his trousers and wink and smile. His smile danced right across his face. "Mikolai Alexievich, Your Excellency, I know you." He would shake his lean, dirty finger threateningly. "Go and sleep it off," his master would smile pacifyingly. "You can't take in Sashka," the stableman would laugh, going up to the railings of the fence. "Mikolai Alexievich, you're like me. Me and you, we're like fish in the water. You and me, we're rich, eh?" Here he would fling his arms wide open to show how rich. "We're known by everybody all over the Don district. We—" Sashka's voice would suddenly sound miserable and surreptitious. "Me and you, Your Excellency, we're good to everybody, only we've both got rotting noses." "What with?" his master would ask, turning purple with laughter. "With vodka!" Sashka would stamp out the words, winking and licking his lips. "Don't drink, Mikolai Alexievich, or we'll be ruined, you and me. We'll drink everything away." "Go and drink this away." Old Listnitsky would throw out a 20-kopeck piece, and Sashka would catch it and hide it in his cap, crying, "Well, goodbye, General." "Have you watered the horses yet?" his master would ask with a smile. "You lousy devil! You son of a swine!" Sashka would turn livid, and in his anger would stutter and shake as though with the ague. "Sashka forget to water the horses, ah? If I was dying, I'd still crawl for a pail to water the horses. And he thinks—" The old man would march off, fuming at the undeserved reproach, cursing and shaking his fist. Everything came naturally to him, even drinking and his familiarity with his master. He was irreplaceable as a stableman. Winter and summer he slept in the stables in an empty stall. He was ostler and shoesmith. He cut grass for the horses in the spring and dug up medicinal roots on the steppe and in the valleys. Bunches of dried herbs, remedies for all the various horse ailments and diseases, hung high up on the stable walls. Winter and summer, a fine, tingling aroma hung like a spider's web about the stall in which Sashka slept. Hay packed as hard as a board, covered with a horse-cloth, and his coat, smelling of horse sweat, served as mattress and bedding to his plank bed. The coat and a sheepskin were all the old man's worldly goods. Tikhon, a healthy and dull-witted Cossack, lived with Lukeria, and was needlessly jealous of her and Sashka. Regularly, once a month, he would take the old man by the button of his greasy shirt and lead him aside. "Old man, don't you set your cap at my woman," he would say. "That depends," Sashka would wink significantly. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself at your age. And you a doctor, too. You look after the horses. You know the Holy Book." "I like them pockmarked. Say goodbye to Lukeria. I'll be taking her away from you. She's like a currant pudding." "Don't let me catch you or I'll kill you," Tikhon would say, sighing, and drawing some copper coins out of his pocket. Life mouldered away in a sleepy torpor at Yagodnaya. The estate lay in a valley remote from all frequented roads, and from the autumn onward all connection with the neighboring villages was broken. In the winter nights the wolf packs emerged from their forest lairs and terrified the horses with their howling. Tikhon used to go to the meadow to frighten them off with shot from his master's double-barreled gun, and Luceria would wait in suspense for the sound of the shot. At such times her imagination transformed bald-headed Tikhon into a handsome and desperately brave youth, and when the door of the servants' quarters slammed and Tikhon entered, she warmly embraced his frozen old bones. In summertime, Yagodnoya was alive until late in the evening with the sound of laborers' voices. The master sowed some 100 acres with grain of various kinds. Occasionally Eugene came home and would wander boredly through the orchard and over the meadow, or sit all the morning with rod and line by the lakeside. Eugene was of medium height and broad-chested. He arranged his hair Cossack fashion, brushing it on the right side. His officer's tunic was always a perfect fit. During the first 10 days of Gregor's life on the estate, he was frequently in the young master's company. One day Benjamin came smiling into the servants' quarters and announced, "The young master wants you, Gregor." Gregor went to Eugene's room and stood at the door. The master pointed to a chair. Gregor seated himself on the very edge. "How do you like our horses?" Listnitsky asked. "They're good horses. The gray is very good. Give him plenty of exercise, but don't gallop him." "So Grandad Sashka told me." Screwing up his eyes, the young master said, "You have to go to the training camp in May, don't you?" "Yes." "I'll speak to the ataman about it. You won't need to go." "Thank you, sir." There was a momentary silence. Unbuttoning the collar of his uniform, Eugene scratched his womanishly white breast. "Aren't you afraid of Aksinia's husband taking her from you?" he asked. "He's thrown her over. He won't take her back." "How do you know?" "I saw one of the men from the village the other day, and he told me Stepan had said so to him." "Aksinia's a fine-looking woman," Listnitsky remarked thoughtfully, staring over Gregor's head and smiling. "Not bad," Gregor agreed, and his face clouded. During the last few days of his furlough, Eugene spent a great deal of time in Gregor's room. Aksinia kept the little room spotlessly clean, and made it gay with feminine gewgaws. The officer chose times for his visit when Gregor was occupied with the horses. He would first go into the kitchen, and stand joking with Luceria for a minute or two, then would pass into the farther room. One day he sat down on a stool, hunching his shoulders, and fixed a shamelessly smiling gaze on Aksinia. She was embarrassed by his presence, and the knitting needles trembled in her fingers. "Well, Aksinia, how are you getting on?" he asked, puffing at his cigarette until the room was filled with blue smoke. "Very well, thank you." Aksinia raised her eyes, and meeting Eugene's transparent gaze, silently telling of his desire, she turned crimson. She replied disconnectedly to his questions, avoiding his eyes and seeking an opportunity to leave the room. "I must go and feed the ducks now," she told him. "Sit a little longer, the ducks can wait," he smiled, and continued to ply her with questions concerning her past life, while his crystal-clear eyes pleaded obscenely. When Gregor came in, Eugene offered him a cigarette and went out soon after. "What did he want?" Gregor asked Aksinia, not looking at her. "How should I know?" Remembering the officer's look, Aksinia laughed forcedly. "He came in and sat there just like this, Grishka." She showed him how Eugene had sat with hunched back, and sat until I was sick of him. "You made yourself pleasant to him, of course." Gregor screwed up his eyes angrily. "You watch out, or I shall send him flying down the steps one day." Aksinia gazed at Gregor with a smile on her lips, and could not be sure whether he was speaking in jest or earnest. Chapter 11. The winter broke during the 4th week of Lent. Open water began to fringe the edges of the Don. The ice melting from the top turned gray and swelled spongily. Of an evening, a howling noise came from the hills, indicating frost according to the time-honored saying, but in reality presaging the approaching thaw. In the morning, the air tingled with the light frost, but by noon the earth was bare in patches, and in the nostrils was a scent of March, of the frozen bark of cherry trees and rotting straw. Miran Grigorievich leisurely made ready for the plowing season, spending his days under the shed, sharpening the teeth of the harrows, and preparing for the thaw. During the 4th week of Lent, old Grishaka fasted. He returned blue with cold from the church, and complained to his daughter-in-law, Lukinichna. "The priest starved me. He's no good. He's as slow as a carter with a load of eggs." "You'd have been wiser to have fasted during Passion Week. It's warmer by then," she told him. "Call Natalia," he replied. "Let her make me a pair of warmer stockings." Natalia still lived in the belief that Griegor would return to her. Her heart waited for him, and would not listen to the warning whisper of sober reason. She spent the nights in a weary yearning, tossing on her bed, crushed by her undeserved and unexpected shame. Another woe was now added to the first, and she awaited its sequel in a cold terror, casting about in her maiden room like a shot lapwing in a forest glade. From the earliest days of her return home, her brother Mitka began to give her queer glances, and one day, catching her in the porch, he asked frankly, "Are you still yearning after Grishka? What is it to do with you? I want to help you get rid of your pain." Natalia glanced into his eyes and was terrified by what she saw there. Mitka's green cat's eyes glittered, and their slits gleamed oilily in the dim light of the porch. Natalia slammed the door and ran to her grandfather's room, standing and listening to the beating of her heart. 2 days later, Mitka came up to her in the yard. He had been turning over fresh hay for the cattle, and green stalks of grass hung from his straight hair and his fur cap. "Don't torture yourself, Natalia." "I'll tell Father," she cried, raising her hands to protect herself. "You're an idiot. What are you shouting for?" "Go away, Mitka. I'll go at once and tell Father. What eyes you make at me. It's a wonder the earth doesn't open up and swallow you up. Don't come near me, Mitka," she pleaded. "I won't now, but I'll come at night. By God, I'll come," he replied. Trembling, Natalia left the yard. That evening she made her bed on the chest and took her younger sister to sleep with her. All night she tossed and turned, her burning eyes seeking to pierce the darkness, her ears alert to the slightest sound, ready to scream the house down. But the silence was broken only by the snores of Grishaka sleeping in the next room, and an occasional grunt from her sister. Mitka had not got over the shame of his recent attempt at marriage, and he went about morose and ill-tempered. He went out every evening, and rarely arrived home again before dawn. He formed associations with women of undesirable reputation in the village, and went to Stepan Astachov's to play cards for stakes. His father watched his behavior, but said nothing. Just before Easter, Natalia met Panteleimon Prokofievich close to Mochov's shop. He called to her. "Wait a moment." She halted. Her heart yearned as she saw her father-in-law's face, mournfully reminding her of Gregor. "Why don't you come and see us sometimes?" the old man asked her diffidently, avoiding her eyes as though he himself had been guilty of some offense against her. "The wife is longing to see you." "Well, perhaps you will come some day?" Natalia recovered from her embarrassment. "Thank you," she said. And after a moment's hesitation, she wanted to say, "Father." She added, "Panteleimon Prokofievich." "I've been very busy at home." "Our Grishka, ah!" The old man shook his head bitterly. "He's tricked us, the scoundrel. How well we'd have got on together." "Oh, well, Father," Natalia spoke in a high-pitched, grating voice. "Clearly it wasn't to be." Panteleimon fiddled about embarrassedly as he saw Natalia's eyes fill with tears. Her lips were pressed together to restrain her desire to weep. "Goodbye, my dear," he said. "Don't grieve over him, the son of a swine. He's not worth the nail on your little finger. Maybe he'll come back. I'm thinking of going to see him, but it's difficult." Natalia walked away with her head sunk on her breast. Panteleimon stood dancing from foot to foot as though about to break into a run. As she turned the corner, Natalia glanced back. The old man was limping across the square, leaning heavily on his stick. As spring approached, the meetings in Stockmann's workshop were held less frequently. The villagers were preparing for the field work, and only Ivan Alexeyevich, the engine-man, and Valyet came from the mill, bringing David with them. On Maundy Thursday, they gathered at the workshop in the early evening. Stockman was sitting at his bench, cleaning a silver ring made from a 50-kopeck piece. A broad bar of rays from the setting sun streamed through the window. The engine man picked up a pair of pincers and turned them over in his hand. "I had to go to the master the other day to ask about a piston," he remarked. "It will have to be taken to Millerova. We can't mend it here. There's a crack in it as long as this." Ivan Alexeyevich measured the length of his little finger. "There's a works at Millerova, isn't there?" Stockman asked, scattering a fine silver rain as he filed the coin. "A steel foundry. I had to spend some days there last year," Ivan replied. "Many workers?" "Some 500. "And what are they like?" The words came deliberately from Stockman. "They're well off. They're none of your proletariat. They're muck." "Why is that?" Valiant asked. "Because they're too well off. Each has his own little house, his wife, and every comfort. And a good half of them are Baptists into the bargain. The master himself is their preacher, and they suck one another's noses, and the dirt on them is so thick you couldn't scrape it off with a rake. Well, and I went to Sergei Platonovich," Ivan Alexeyevich continued his story, "and he had company with him, so he told me to wait outside. I sat down and waited and heard them talking through the door. Mokhov was saying there was going to be a war with the Germans very soon. He had read it in a book. But someone else said there couldn't be a war between Germany and Russia because Germany needed our grain. Then I heard a third voice. I found out afterwards it was that of the officer, old Lisnitsky's son. There will be a war, he said, between Germany and France, over vineyards, but it has nothing to do with us. What do you think, Osip Davidovich?" Ivan asked, turning to Stockman. "I'm no good at prophecies," Stockman replied, staring fixedly at the ring in his hand. "Once they do start, we'll have to go. Like it or not, they'll drag us there by the hair," Valiant declared. "It's like this, boys," Stockman said, gently taking the pincers out of the engine man's hands. He spoke seriously, evidently intending to explain the matter thoroughly. Valiant sat himself comfortably on the bench, and David's lips shaped into an O, revealing his strong teeth. In definite, well-chosen words, Stockman outlined the struggle of the capitalist states for markets and colonies. When he had finished, Ivan Alexeyevich asked anxiously, "Yes, but where do we come in?" "Your heads will ache for the drunken orgies of others," Stockman smiled. "Don't talk like a child," Valiant said venomously. "You know the saying, the master tugs at the lead, but the dog shakes its head." "And what was Lisnitsky visiting Mokhov for?" David changed the subject. "He was on his way to the station." "Yes, and here's some more news. When I went out of the house I saw, who do you think? Griegor Melyukov. He was standing outside with a whip in his hand." "He's Lisnitsky's coachman," David explained. It was getting late, and Ivan Alexeyevich initiated a general movement to depart. Stockman accompanied his guests to the gate, then locked up the workshop and went into the hut. Griegor returned on Palm Sunday from his journey with Eugene to the station. He found the thaw had eaten away the snow. The road had broken up within a couple of days. At a Ukrainian village some 20 miles back from the station, he all but lost his horses as he was crossing a stream. He arrived at the village early in the evening. During the previous night, the ice of the rivulet had broken and floated away, and the stream was swollen and foaming with muddy brown water. The tavern at which he had stopped to feed the horses on the way out lay on the farther side of the stream. The water might easily rise still higher during the night, and Griegor decided to cross. He drove to the point where he had crossed over the ice on the outward journey, and found the stream had overflowed its banks. A piece of fencing and half a cartwheel were eddying in the middle. There were fresh traces of sledge runners on the bare sand at the edge. He halted the horses and jumped down to look at the marks more closely. At the water's edge, the tracks turned a little to the left and disappeared into the stream. He measured the distance to the other side with his eyes. 50 yards at the most. He went to the horses to see that the harness was in good order. At that moment, an aged Ukrainian came towards him from the nearest hut. "Is there a good crossing here?" Griegor asked him, waving his reins at the seething brown flood. "People crossed there this morning." "Is it deep?" "No, it might flow into the sleigh." Griegor gathered up the reins and, holding his knout ready, urged on the horses with a curt, imperative command. They moved unwillingly, snorting and snuffing at the water. Griegor cracked his whip and stood up on the seat. The bay on the left shook its head and suddenly pulled on the traces. Griagor glanced down at his feet. The water was swirling over the front of the sleigh. At first the horses were wading up to their knees, but suddenly the stream rose to their breasts. Griagor tried to turn them back, but they refused to answer the rein and began to swim. The tail of the sleigh was swung round by the current, and the horses' heads were forced upstream. The water flowed in waves over their backs. The sleigh rocked and pulled them back strongly. "Hey! Hey! To the right!" the Ukrainian shouted, running along the bank and waving his three-cornered cap in his hands. Savagely raging, Griagor incessantly hallooed and urged on the horses. The water foamed in eddies behind the dragging sleigh. The runners struck against a jutting pile, the remains of the bridge which had been swept away overnight, and the sleigh turned over with extraordinary ease. With a groan, Griagor plunged in head first, but he did not lose his grip of the reins. He was dragged by the edges of his sheepskin, by his feet, drawn with gentle insistence, rocking and turning over and over at the side of the sleigh. He succeeded in clutching a runner, dropped the reins, and hauled himself along, hand over hand, making his way to the swinging trees. He was about to seize the iron-shod end of the swinging tree when one horse, in its struggle against the current, lashed out with its hind leg and struck him on the knee. Choking, Griagor threw out his hands and caught at the traces. His body fierily tingling with the cold, he managed to reach the horse's head, and the animal fixed the maddened, mortally terrified gaze of its bloodshot eyes right into his dilated pupils. Again and again he grasped at the slippery leather reins, but they eluded his fingers. Somehow he managed at last to seize them. Abruptly his legs scraped along ground. Dragging himself to the edge of the water, he stumbled forward and fell in the foaming shallows, knocked off his feet by the horses' breasts. Trampling over him, the horses tugged the sleigh violently out of the water and halted a few paces away, exhausted, shuddering, and steaming. Unconscious of any pain, Griagor jumped to his feet. The cold enveloped him as though in unbearably hot dough. He was trembling even more than the horses, feeling that he was as weak on his legs as an unweaned infant. He gathered his wits, and turning the sleigh onto its runners, drove the horses off at a gallop to get them warm. He flew into the street of the village as though attacking an enemy, and turned into the first open gate without slackening his pace. Fortunately, he had chanced upon a hospitable Ukrainian who sent his son to attend to the horses and himself helped Griagor to undress. In a tone, permitting of no question, he ordered his wife to light the stove. Until his own clothes were dry, Griagor stretched himself out on top of the stove in his host's trousers. After a supper of cabbage soup, he went to sleep. He set off again long before dawn came. A good 85 miles of travel lay before him, and every minute was precious. The untracked confusion of the flooded spring steppe was at hand. Every little ravine or gully was become a roaring torrent of snow water. The black, bare road exhausted the horses. Over the hard road of the early morning frost, he reached a village lying 3 miles off his route, and stopped at a crossroad. The horses were smoking with sweat. Behind him lay the gleaming track of the sleigh-runners in the ground. He abandoned the sleigh and set off again, riding one horse bareback and leading the other by the reins. He arrived at Yagodnoye in the morning of Palm Sunday. Old Lisnitsky listened attentively to his story of the journey and went to look at the horses. Sashka was leading them up and down the yard, angrily eyeing their sunken flanks. "How are they?" the master asked. "They haven't been overdriven, have they?" "No, the bay has a sore on the chest where the collar is rubbed, but it's nothing." "Go and get some rest," Lisnitsky indicated Griagor with his hand. Griagor went to his room, but he had only one night's rest. The next morning Benjamin came and called to him. "Griagor, the master wants you, at once." The general was shuffling about the hall in felt slippers. Only after Griagor had coughed twice did he look up. "Ah, yes, go and saddle the stallion and my horse. Tell Lukeria not to feed the dogs. They're going hunting." Griagor turned to leave the room. His master stopped him with a shout. "Do you hear? And you're going with me."